Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami Namatu Acharya Sati. The last thing that I chant is Namatu, which is Namatu is to namasagan, to revere, to hold up, elevate, pay respect to Acharyati, Acharya, one's teacher. And Venerable Ajahn Liam, who's now Luang Por Liam, getting on in years, who was one of Venerable Ajahn Chah's kind of right-hand monks. And he always used to chant that, and I always liked it, because it can be to the great teacher of the Buddha, or it can be to the teacher, one's immediate teacher. So I always like that. Ajahn Chah used to do another one that I wanted to memorize before I came, but I didn't get that together. So, but in saying that, one of the things that Ajahn Ro and I spoke about was that people perhaps would be interested in my experience with Luang Por Chah in Thailand, and my intimate relationship that I had with him in his waning phases of his deterioration, not to his death, but prior to that. So what I'd like to do is make an effort to weave some of these things together. My memory is vague in some situations, but I've been reflecting on this, and kind of some stories and things have been coming up. So that's what I would like to speak about this evening. His first trip to this country, as many of you may know, was in 1977, accompanied by Luang Por Sumedho. And then that time, as you probably heard the history, and Ajahn Amro's repeated it some, and things where the monks actually ended up staying. Ajahn Chah returned to Thailand, and Ajahn Sumedho, Ajahn Anando, Viradhammo, Kemadhammo stayed on, and I was then the abbot at Wat Pah Nanachat in Thailand, the International Forest Monastery. And so kind of life went on for a year or so, and we would hear news of England and how it was going, and through either letters or people coming and going between the two countries. And my memory of this trip in 1979, which I think is a good starting point, I was invited to accompany him, to come along as his attendant and translator, and be with him during that visit in May and June of 1979. So our first stop was Chithurst, and Chithurst was in the very early days. It was still quite a mess, and things had not been at all. I mean, rooms had been prepared, and of course there was a lot of preparation for his visit. But I remember it was May, so it was still cold as it can be here. And I think one of the first incidents that I recall is they decided to light a fire in kind of reception room. I don't know what it's called now, but to keep him warm. And this gentleman that had owned the Chithurst house prior to that was a miser, and he had just collected everything. Some of you maybe saw the film The Buddha Comes to Sussex, and if you haven't, it's quite entertaining to watch. But along with not throwing away anything, from a newspaper to bottles and just you name it, he hadn't had the chimneys cleaned. So they light up this roaring kind of fire in the reception room, and sudden people are noticing more smoke than should be appropriate for a fire. And the chimney had caught fire, so I called the fire brigade, and they come and put the hoses down the chimney, and it was quite an exciting event. So he was pretty entertained by it all, I think. And so it all happened without incident. Nobody got hurt, and nothing really got damaged that much. And I think from then on out, they cleaned the chimneys before they lit any more fires. One of the themes that during that trip that is really a striking and that I recollect very clearly is his emphasis, as we've been talking, and earlier today Ajahn was talking about the 5 precepts. And he was almost hammering these precepts at people, not in a preachy way, but really emphasizing the importance of virtuous conduct, of body and speech being virtuous, being skillful, being not harmful. And it's really, the 5 precepts really boil down to how you and I behave and manifest what we say and what we do. So not to harm, not to take things which are not given. So those are physical. The 3rd, sexual misconduct, that's also physical. And then the 4th, of course, is frivolous, or lying, fundamentally lying. So that's to do with speech. And then final with drug and drink, anything that would lead you and I to heedlessness. And certainly from my experience with drugs or drink, that it was much easier to be heedless and careless and perhaps break one of the other precepts, do something very foolish when one was under the influence of drug or drink. So he was very emphatic within us, and I believe he also saw that here people were very interested in meditation and Buddhism. Can I have the little bell stick, please? If you'd be so kind. Ajahn Bodhipala, can you relinquish that for me? Thank you. Much obliged. And so he saw that genuine interest to practice, which of course Asian Buddhists in Thailand, to speak specifically Thais, were not so interested in meditation. Their primary function they saw was dana, to give, support the monks, put food in the bowl. And they were quite happy to do that. But he saw here that people were really very keen on practice, but that they might not see sila. So sila, often practices be described, and I don't know any sutta, scriptural resource for this. Ajahn Amaro may, or I'm not sure, but would talk about dana, sila, and bhavana. And that was a great emphasis in Thailand, and he really spoke about along with that. So dana, of course, we know is the act of giving and of generosity, of giving a part of oneself, either monetarily or a more personal way, to prepare food, as people like to do, and come to offer to the community, to share a part of one's self. And of course, when we cook and put love and energy, it's really a lovely thing to make that offering, to give. And then sila is our precepts, and the 5 precepts for people in everyday life, and to live and to be able to live in harmony, to not harm each other, and to behave in ways that are unskillful, either by body or speech. And ultimately, by restraining body and speech, we begin to restrain the mind, understand the mind more, because it's the mind that is always the culprit, isn't it? Before I say or do something, the precursor is thought and intention, volition, even if it's somewhat unconscious. So he would emphasize that. And then the 3rd was bhavana, and bhavana usually translate as the action of practice, the actual application of the teaching. So the three were complementary. And so he always carried a cane. And so he would pick up his cane and he says, Tansin Bhavana, เหมือนกับไม้เท้านี้ถ้าจับตรงนี้มันก็ยกหมดถ้าจับตรงนี้ก็ยกหมดถ้าจับตรงนี้ก็ยกหมดมันก็ยกหมดมันก็เข้ากัน So it translates as, if you need a translation, he said it didn't matter what part of this cane or this piece of wood here, this our little bell stick, you picked up, that the other two were connected to it. So you couldn't just pick up the middle without the ends, or you couldn't pick up the end without the middle and the other end, and so on. So dana, sila, bhavana were intimately, they were interconnected. And so the emphasis, well, okay, maybe we want to bhavana. Everybody wants to bhavana, so I want to practice, yes, Venerable Master, I want to practice meditation for enlightenment. But then he would say, what about your precepts? And so precepts was the one kind of that the Thais and Westerners had in common, that they were a little bit weary to want to have to kind of have rules, to go against. And sometimes some of the monks would teach, well, if you can't keep 5, keep 4. If you can't keep 4, try to keep 3. So we're going downhill real quick, and of course you can't do 3 too. And ultimately, well, can you keep 1 precept? Maybe just don't kill people. Don't hurt anything. And if you can't keep 1 of the 5, then maybe if you can come to the monastery occasionally, that might be. And of course, for simple village folk, that was quite difficult. Say the first precept, not harming as much as their livelihood. I mean, if it moved, they ate it. And I don't mean that in any kind of demeaning or critical way, but that life was very sparse, and so they had their rice paddies, what things they could grow. And the Northeast was very known for being very sparse and hard to grow and cultivate things, so that fish and whatever seasonal things they had, they would catch and eat. And so that was part of their way of life. So the precepts they couldn't, but they could do dana, they could do the giving. And so it's lovely to see now that, like here in this country, we have the 3, I think, manifesting much more. We have people who are already interested in practice, but one can't really begin to practice and not start to realize, well, my everyday behavior is impacted. So if I've done something before I come on a retreat that was unskillful and harmful or unkind in any way, then most likely, as we've been reflecting on things beyond in other parts of our lives, that's going to kind of come up and kind of plague our mind states. It's going to be an agitation, a concern, so that the impeccability that is expected of a monastic, that you and I are required to keep a certain impeccability in our lives as well, what we say, what we do, and ultimately what we think. So I remember being here, and it was hard. It was hard being here because I was American and I hadn't come here to live yet, but I was very self-conscious of my American accent. And of course, I knew a few English people in Thailand, but I was here and surrounded by the English, so it was quite intimidating for me. Everybody was speaking like English, like proper English, Queen's English, whatever. I hear these accents and pronunciations and everything, and I knew that I was very self-conscious of my American accent, but I did the best that I could in translating. And sometimes he would be very emphatic with the precepts, and Sumedha and I used to chuckle about this, because he would say things like, to Thais, it would be very direct, and could be coarse, but not intended to be coarse for coarse sake, but just, kind of the way it is. And so especially the 3rd precept around sexuality, sexual misconduct, sometimes that would be very difficult, the things that he would say, which I still would find difficult, to try to find a kind of a diplomatic, if you will, translation of some of the things that he said. But that being the case, that there was this emphasis. So here, then we went to America and had these, he continued to emphasize that and how important it was. And during that time he had the cane, and so he was beginning to talk about his instability, physical instability. he began to feel unstable on his feet and have some mild dizzy spells and so on. And he really valued me being with him because I was big, I was strong, much stronger at that time, but that he kind of felt comfortable with me rather than a little time out going along with him, that if he fell or whatever, that I could probably help him, support him. So it was a great honor for me to have that opportunity. And then remembering many memorable occasions. And I've never told this story publicly, and I wasn't sure if I would. And I haven't told it that many times privately. And now that I've opened my mouth, I just wondered if I should have. But we're going to have a timeout. I'm going to consult with Ajahn if I should actually tell this story or not. It will be modified for general consumption, because it requires revealing a bit about myself, and so I think that's important for me, and not in I have to confess this or whatever, but that to be real with you and the experiences that I shared with him and had with him, because there was always love and kindness there. So we got to our place we went to stay with my family after being here. Then we went to Bury Mass. They had a retreat in his honor. Jack Cornfield was there and several others, and it was a lovely time, lovely retreat. People really appreciated him. And then we traveled to see my family. And the first story was quite sweet, because my mother had visited, her and my father had visited me in Thailand, but I hadn't seen my grandmother. And so arriving in Seattle, and Ajahn Chah and I, and have our gear and everything, our kit, as they say here, getting off the plane. And my mother was very clear with my grandmother, her mother, that he's now a monk and things, and he has these rules. So so you definitely can't touch him. That's not appropriate. And so she was very emphatic with that with my grandmother. So we get out and we come through the gates, and and then all of a sudden there we are. There's my family, my father and my mother and my grandmother, and we're kind of walking out, and my grandmother just goes ahead of everybody. She comes right up to me and she just embraces me. So I've got this grandmother in my arms, and Ajahn Chah over here, and I think I probably had his bag that I was carrying, and I just looked over and I says, "This is Granny." and then at that same time my mother comes up, "Mother, I told you couldn't touch him." So she was jealous because she couldn't come over and hug me. So there was rather a tense moment, of which Ajahn Chah found very amusing. So he would tease me about that, the hugging grandmother. And one of my favorite places, and still is on the earth, is Stevens Pass, which is in the Cascade Mountain Range in Washington State, where I grew up in Seattle. And so we had a ski cabin in the mountains on this pass, and my parents had actually purchased it when I was in the military, and so it was a lovely place. It was right on a river in the mountains, and so we took him up there, and I remember walking with him, and he says, "Niku patata," this is real woods, real forest, because it was in the mountains and the fresh air and everything. It was just a gorgeous, lovely place. And so we settled in to stay, and then the cabin next door to ours, because my parents were up there, and they had they were letting us use our Ajahn Chah, and then Paul Brighter was there, and we were staying. And one of my struggles as a monk, of course, was around sexuality, and that we all have our struggles, and it was certainly one that was difficult for me, for living a celibate life. And so I remember, I had memories of my father, and he had a barber shop, and he had certain things around the barber shop for men. And so when we were up at the cabin, I was kind of, and this is the other piece that was interesting. He was talking about like how in Western society, he said, they're kind of like, and it had to do with precepts and virtue and things that people were getting more and more kind of reckless, and that they were like exposing themselves, and shorter pants and shorter shirts, and exposing more and more skin, and just kind of this what he saw as just a kind of because in Thailand, of course, everybody's proper. You never expose really any part of your body above the knees, male and female, in many ways. And so he says, pretty soon he says, "Mot, our mot," they're going to take everything off, Everybody running around naked, That was just kind of his way of saying. So, being young and still being quite deluded, I had a certain curiosity about kind of what that mot meant for, Western culture. So I happened to come across some of my father's Playboys in the cabin. And this is like really playing with fire for a monk. I mean, like serious fire. And so I found these Playboys, and of course, there they were. And he had quite a stack of them. And so I flipped through a few of them, and very unskillful. But I hadn't done anything really serious. I hadn't, broken any, but it wasn't really appropriate. And couldn't imagine, the Thai people coming in. Yeah, I was looking at some pornographic material last night. And so, but the next morning, I said to him, "It's happened," I said. And I was curious partly too, because, in my day they weren't, kind of totally exposing themselves. These degrading magazines that men would flock after. And these they had, so, women were totally naked. And I said, "Well, it's happened," I said. They're totally exposed themselves. He said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, my dad has some magazines here." "Well, what magazines?" So I got my foot in my mouth big time now. So I said, "Well, they're in the other room." He says, "Amabung, bring them here. Let me have a look." Amabung, that's like Lao for, let's have a look. So I didn't want to grab the whole stack, so I think I grabbed 2 or 3. So I handed him one respectfully, here's the great master, Playboy. And I didn't want to here's the good one. I'm glad this is going fairly well, because I was quite nervous about this. So he flips it open, and, it didn't take him long to kind of get to the pictures of young women exposing themselves, and and he gets to the centerfold, and opens it up, and flips through, and then at one point he says, "Like a monkey." And then he threw it down, like in disgust, and he says, "Bye." So he threw this magazine down, and he said, "Go. Just, bye. It's just, we're going to go." So he got up, and we walked. And he was very kind of, in a space that I just was like, "Oh, what have I done?" But he asked, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. So we're walking in the woods, and it's gorgeous and everything. And of course, I'm just vibrating with this Playboy, and I'm just giving it to the great master. And what's going to happen next? If I would have died then, I don't know where I've been reborn.
Do you have his mention? In Hugh Hefner's mansion?
Yeah, probably. So we came back and he didn't say anything. Best of I can recall, he didn't say anything. And of course, it was a gorgeous day up in the mountains, and we sat, like our meal we were having, on the riverbank right in front of the cabin, and this gorgeous river flowing, mountains across, and just gorgeous. And then he started talking. He said, I was really disgusted. He wasn't disgusted and like, this is disgusting, but it was so shocking to him to see that people would do that. So he saw it as very degrading, as of course it is. And so it was very powerful for him. Of course, when he was looking at the centerfold, when I was looking at the centerfold, were totally two different universes. And so he had seen this just for what it was, and was very, upset. And he said, and he was talking, and then this car pulls up. And it was like a minivan. And there were like a car full, maybe 4 or 5, not a lot, of people that had seen him and heard him talk in this city. And they had come up to give food. And he says, "Who's that?" And I says, "Oh, that's some of the people that had come to your talk. They'd come to make an offering." And he looks over at me and he says, "I was ready to go back." He said. And then he saw these people, so it was almost like that moment the Buddha saw that there are people with but little dust in their eyes. And then he started laughing. And then I started laughing. And we just started having this belly laugh together at the bank of this river, this beautiful mountain. It's just this moment of like these two kind of extreme, one on one hand, this kind of hopelessness of humanity and just degraded and indulgent. And then here are the people that have but little dust in their eyes. So that was a very powerful moment for me in how that happened, and obviously for him, that he saw there was something there, that this was worthwhile. And I don't think he would have picked up, but his heart felt like, why bother? If this is kind of, and he wasn't like said the whole society is like this, but he just saw one element that really he found very, very shocking. So fast forward a little bit in the with the time, so the rest of the trip was very wonderful, to be with my family and for them to be able to honor them and be in our home and stuff. And I feel that my father's suicide years later was very influenced, not his suicide, but that he had met this great master. And I know, and I'd been home previous to that. I mean, they already know how to bow. They'd been to Thailand. So my father was like very proud. Like when we'd visit, he says, "Well, this is what you're supposed to do with them." So right in front of his friends and everything, I was there sitting. And he'd get down on his hands and knees and do this perfect prostration. He says, "Well, this is how you show respect." And I was like, wow. And of course, they had no reservation about doing that, learning that in Thailand. One other poignant moment was, my father was out working, and he was not quite as big as me, but he was very German descent, stocky, strong man. And he was out working around. He loved to putter around this cabin. So he was out moving these big stones, and Ajahn Chah and I'd been walking, so we come back, and here's my dad. His name was Norm. And so Ajahn Chah called him Pa Norm. Pa is like father, so Father Norm, which is, in the villages, everybody, it was kind of like aunt and uncle, aunties and uncles. It would be, Uncle Michael and Auntie Ruki and so on. They would, and so he says, "Pa Norm, Kang Lang no?" He says, "Norm," says, you're very strong. And my dad was kind of, yeah, I like to, work and everything, and he's sweating and everything. And he says, แต่ต้องทำจิตใจแข็งแรงเหมือนร่างกาย but you have to make your heart as strong as your body. And my dad just kind of whimpered a little bit, almost like he just went right to, he wasn't intimidated or anything, just said, this is what you need to do. And he was just, you're right. So he saw that. So it was this kind of very teachable moment, of course. But as his son, I couldn't do that. And he said to me when we got this, hands off the parents, leave them to me. I'll take care of them. Don't even think about it. That's my job. And he was very very kind and giving appropriate teachings which he could. So we got back. I want to fast forward a little bit. We got back to Thailand, and I'd mentioned, I think, that's when I went off, and he gave me the opportunity to go off and live on my own in a cave. And I got into this cave, and which is a very, very trying time. And my vow in the cave, my adhitthana, my resolution, was that unless something other than my own desire came along, that I would not leave this cave. So something would happen. And people knew where I was. I mean, it wasn't wise to go wandering off and not let somebody know where you were and how you could could get a hold of you. I mean, you could do it, but it wasn't the wisest thing to do. And so I spent 4 months, alone in this incredible cave. I mean, it was not like this dark kind of, it was this huge, it was the top of kind of a mountain. And, it had open spaces, and it had closed spaces, and the wind blew through, and it was really a lovely place. But it really kind of, kicked me about in a way I'd never been kicked about. And that's partly why I did it. And that's really another story. But what's interesting as I was going through this is that I was struggling, and the end of the rains retreat came. But I was determined that I was going to stay. Well, lo and behold, one of these aerograms they had these aerograms, they folded in 3. So the cheapest way to send news home or wherever. And of course, those of us that were sending these things home, I know, Ajahn Santa will remember that you could get an incredible amount if you wrote small. So, our parents must have really struggled. We're sitting there, and maybe 2 or 3 or 4 days or a week, and we're kind of writing this. You need a magnifying glass, but you could get all this great information. And one of these aerograms folded up, and off it would go, and it was very inexpensive. Well, I got a telegram. Well, I don't think it was an aerogram, maybe just a postcard letter. Well, Ajahn Sumedho's coming to visit, from England. Oh, Ajahn Sumedho's coming. He'll definitely want to see me. I need to be there, He'd want me to be there. So I think that was my own desire that took me out of the cave, but it was enough to send me out of there, because I was definitely, had suffered enough, as the case was. So I came back, and then I came back to Wat Pah Pong. And so I'd been away about a year and a half, I guess, since the trip. I was getting close to 19. It would have been 1979, so getting close to, I guess, 80, late 1980, when Ajahn Sumedho came. I don't know if you remember the year, but he'd come for a visit. Early 81, was it? Yeah. So I came back to Wat Pah Pong, and his health was deteriorating, but he was still himself. He was still in good shape. A little bit more feeble, and was taking some medications. And of course, when you're a great teacher like that, I mean, there's doctors just want to help and give medications and everything. And so it was appropriate, and in ways, in all fairness to me, that as I came back, I mean, there was help needed and things around him and his health. And so Ajahn Sumedho's visit. And then it was coming close to the rains retreat, which is like July, August, September, or late June, early July, August, September. When the rains come in Thailand, of course, it's the time where we enter the traditional Vasa, the rains retreat, which dates from the time of the Buddha. The rains, not appropriate to be kind of walking and doing wandering and stay in one place. And that was what's kind of become the winter retreat here, although they still observe the Vasa. And as his health was deteriorating, and so it was decided that he needed some rest time. Both he decided and was open to actually taking some rest time, because it was hard for him to do that because he was so giving. So we went up to Tumsang Pet, which is a cave of diamond light, where my little story about the cave of diamond light LSD trip happened, that I shared yesterday or day before. I can't be responsible for when I said what. Everything starts to kind of come together or blend together on the context of a retreat. So, and Kun Yington who was a very wealthy supporter of his, a Chinese woman, a lovely woman, and she had built this big, beautiful sala open-air pavilion on the top of Tumsang Pet, of the cave of the Diamond Light Monastery, and then had built this very lovely kuti for him. So it was on. It had a big veranda, so people could sit there and come to visit. And that had a private quarters, was right there, but it was kind of all inside with mosquito screen and windows, and a loo was there, and so it had everything that he needed, a little kitchen, and was really built very, very nicely. And so he had me go up there. I'm not sure who else was there at the time for Western monks, but I was kind of more and more becoming kind of his personal attendant. And this is, I think, where it ties into our aging and choices and things, and which I'll try to, kind of weave into this, because realize how relevant it was in many ways, but unique, because we're talking about a great master and a different situation, but still someone who's respected your love and certain decisions that he's making or others are making. So one evening. So we would stay, and people would come and visit. And so it was my job to be the bad guy. I had to say, well, now it's time for him to rest. And the ties are not like, if they show up, and this is what he would normally do, and this is part of the reason for his deteriorating health. They show up, and he's just about ready. He'd been sitting there for 2 or 3 hours or longer, hadn't even, got up to relieve himself. And somebody else would show up, and he might just sit back down. And he could sit for hours and just be with people and talk and converse. Just this incredible presence and energy. But, it had an impact. An impact. A physical body can only take so much. So I started to regulate that. Of course, that wasn't very popular. He was always very accessible, and now this big Western monk, was going to say, no, rest time. But rest time. and that's what I had to do, and I knew it, and I didn't like doing it, but I was willing to do it because I was trying to care for him as best as I could. And one evening, we were sitting there, and we had discovered cocoa, black, just dark chocolate cocoa. We already could have sugar, so cocoa we could have. And then we discovered Coffee Mate. And so, the community looked at Coffee Mate and does it have anything, and this whole thing that the Sangha can go through to decide whether this is allowable to have in the evening. We could have sugar. So Coffee Mate, like cocoa, sugar, Coffee Mate, and hot water made this, for a monk that doesn't get hardly anything in the evening, made this delicious chocolate drink. Of course, we all know now Coffee Mate's pretty rancid kind of stuff. There's not a lot of good things in it. And he couldn't say Coffee Mate, so he called it a communist. So one evening, it was Guy, I think, that was there. A guy, or summoner Guy, if I remember. I don't know if Ajahn Santa remembers. Anyway, so we're sitting there one evening, and it's just the monks, just a handful of us, myself, and he says to the summoner, he says, "Make me a communist." That sounds really funny, doesn't it? In other words, make me a chocolate drink, but communist, that's all the ingredients and everything. So I give him his communist, and he's sitting there and sipping it. And it's gorgeous up there. It's still, it's quiet. The top of this mountain, you look up and it's just like you're in the middle of the universe. It's just the stars are so amazing, It's just really, so it's still, there's a breeze usually on top of this. So it's really lovely, a lovely place to be. And it was Ajahn Sumedho's favorite place, as a monastery. So he's sitting there sipping. And as we did, I mean, these were some of the most special times to be with him, and just quiet, and just being in his presence, and nobody to be and nowhere to go. It was wonderful. And he says, "Sabay no, Prabhakaro." Yes, we're pretty contented, right, Prabhakaro? I said, "Kapom, Luang Por," respectfully saying, "Yes, Luang Por." Kat yang dio. We're missing one thing. I look up at him and I said, "Ben yang Luang Por." What? Pu ying. Women. Everything was perfect, but we're still missing something. Women. We need women. And of course I knew he didn't say, well, let's see if we can arrange something. But it might have been very directed, as I'm sure Santa Chito and Ajanamaro were kind of chuckling, especially after now I've revealed the Playboy story. So that it was directed for me a lot. But it was so lovely because only he could say that. And it was kind of like that here's life at its best, really. I mean, what more could one ask for? You have this beautiful place, it's peaceful and it's still, but then the mind can say, well, if it was different, and, So it was so funny, because he just could be just so direct. Kadyang dio, what's that? Women, we're missing one thing, and he just... And we kind of chuckled, and he laughed, and everybody laughed, and kind of passed. That rains retreat, he started to go downhill fairly quickly, and he was, I would travel with him. He had a minivan that was given to him by this supporter, and he wanted to travel to all of his main branch monasteries, all of his senior monks, because there had been an incident with one of his senior monks that was very controversial, that he had actually, had intercourse with with a village woman. And so there had been all this uproar and everything, and that had kind of passed. But it was still reverberating through the community. And so he wanted to travel to all of his all of the branch monasteries, and it was like he was putting his affairs in order, and that's where I started to realize how relevant this was. Because he knew, I believe he knew, that how his health was, the direction his health was going. And this was very important, the things that he had to say. And because this was so, such a severe kind of incident that had been accused of this, one of his closest, most senior disciples, and I remember going over there with him to the monastery before we got up to the cave of the Diamond Light. And everybody was looking to him to make a decision, let's you decide, if he's guilty or not. So there was the whole village, a big turnout, all these people, and we show up, and he gets up onto the Dhamma seat, and he said, you've invited me here to, make a decision between, this Ajahn and this village woman. He said, I can't do that. There's two people that know, and there's only two people that know. He says, I know where mine's been, or hasn't been. So in other words, he knew he'd been restrained, had not in any way been inappropriate. So he was very direct, and so there's two people that know. I can't make a decision. I can't decide this matter for you. These two people know and only know. So if they're guilty or not guilty, that has to be decided by them. So he was not going to come in there and say, make a decision or point in a certain direction. So they have to. And so he was also saying, they have to live with this action if in fact it is true. And he couldn't really know that. And he wasn't trying to really know it, although I think he knew. So as we visited these monasteries, that was one of the issues that came up. And of course these senior monks were all disciples and had known each other. So this issue came up. And what was very interesting is that he knew that that they would be struggling with this. And that he wanted to, it was almost like a warning that this is possible. So he wasn't saying he did it, he didn't do it, because he didn't know that, and he wasn't going to take on that kind of, wait for somebody else. That wasn't his karma. That was these two people's karma that were, potentially had this incident. But he really emphasized that this was possible, and that these are kind of things that, could start happening, that to be careful that. And so the whole context now, years later, and this isn't the first time I've had the reflection, but really the first time that I've had the opportunity and felt appropriate to share this. And one other thing he said that was very, very powerful, he said about this teacher, he says, this monk is capable of killing somebody. He just said it. And I just remember it so distinctly. And this woman and this monk, this woman was actually murdered. And as far as I know, he actually killed her. And was eventually disrobed, put into jail and everything. And so I remember this warning that he was capable of this. And it was the one monastery, one senior monk that he never let any of us go to spend time with, which is very interesting. So you just kind of see the complexity of this relationship and things. So to all these monasteries, he was like giving his final kind of instructions almost, and things to, be that you'll have to take care of things, although he wasn't saying it. But as I can fast forward in my own mind, see that he was putting certain affairs in order. And I was kind of the one person that was with him through all of this whole kind of time period. And that the message stayed the same, to not like accuse, but just kind of warn, this monk is probably not so stable. And I remember he was, when I'd see him around Luang Por Chah, there was a certain disrespect, and there had been an incident years earlier where he was angry with Ajahn Chah for having said something, and he actually supposedly had a knife and was going to make, Angulimala, make an attempt on the master's life. And his disciple, not Ajahn Chah, but this other monk's disciples actually knew of this, were very frightened, so they positioned themselves between this monk and Ajahn Chah. And I only heard this story, but so there was something really deeply karmic kind of connection here with him and this particular monk, and how things kind of unfolded. I'm not terribly clear, kind of after that rains retreat and this traveling around and things. And what I do remember, it became very clear that I was to be with him. There was we developed this ability to be very sensitive to being invited or not. So, like when the rains retreat would be coming close, monks would be going to various places, and he said, "Well, where do you want to go?" And everybody would always "Leo Tai Luang Po," where do you want to go? Depends on you, wherever you choose. And so we wouldn't make that decision. We kind of humbled ourselves to wherever we might be. I'll stay here if you want to send me off to the most remote place where they just eat plain rice and dung beetles or whatever. I'll go. That was the humility that we gave. So it was the same thing in going with him as he traveled, because it was a great honor, and it was kind of a coveted position. Monks are human beings like everybody else, so to actually be his attendant. So I never assumed that I would go with him. I never assumed that. And but he'd always say, get your stuff ready. We're going to, Wat Kun, or Wat Bung Ka Luang, or wherever. This monastery, that monastery. So one day he hadn't said anything, so I had all his. I'd always prepare his stuff. Had his bowl robe. He was all robed up, ready to go, and I just came and put his bowl, and he looks at me and says, "How about you say? Where's your bowl?" I hadn't prepared anything because he hadn't said anything, and I said, "Well, I hadn't prepared it." He says, "Get it." So from then on, I knew. It was just there was a message in that I knew. If he went, then I went. That he wanted me with him. That I didn't. I could assume. You know, it was a very poignant moment for me, and a great honor. A lot happened from there until his severe deterioration, until he couldn't speak. And you know, as far as words, verbal words, you know, I believe I was with him when his last words, which was no great kind of proclamation or anything, but because I certainly don't remember him speaking after that particular time, but came to the point where we went down for this surgery, and that was one of the most difficult times. And because of this dizziness and things that he was having, that the doctors that he was seeing at the time felt that he had hydrocephalus, which is, you know, water on the brain. And they would insert us. That it was suggested that he have a stent inserted. So a stent is really it's just a little pump that they insert into a part of the brain. I think it's a fairly common surgery. And then they ran the tube down. I forget if they went in through where they went in through the stomach, yeah, and put this. But I think there wasn't any scarring. The scar was on his head, back through, yeah, and they shoved it right down through into where. So when you pumped it, it was just this little pump, you know. And it would pump. The idea was to take the excess water, which they felt was putting pressure on the brain and causing the dizziness and stuff. So this was quite controversial, and there were a lot of people that didn't agree and were worried and all of that. And so it put me in a very precarious situation, because I was with him and doing my absolute best to honor his wishes. So comes in, Gregor, with your question and things, and so. It was an incredible amount of pressure that I am able to kind of acknowledge now, but at the time I was just there and doing the best that I could. And my primary concern was like, what did he want? You know, that was the word. And if I had to be a jerk, you know, a bad monk and say no or keep people away, I would do it. You know, if that's what he really wanted, and that was what's needed for his health, because my intention was to protect him, to care for him, to do the absolute best I could for that. And that was one of the reasons, because no time could go out and kind of turn Thai people away. It's not going to happen. Culturally, it was just so taboo, you know, to do that, and they wouldn't do it. And so there was a lot of like, you know, where they should have this, and people were worried, you know, are going to be punching a hole in his brain, and I mean, people were really pretty freaked out. And I was with him, and we're there, and just, you know, a day or so before the surgery. And he just said, you know what? It's my brain. My head. You know? Doctors say it will help. So his intention was, all right, if this would help, and that he could live on longer and have, so he made that decision. And so the surgery went forward, and it was quite sweet, really. He said he wanted to be warned before he went into surgery about the anesthesia. You know, he was going to like fight the anesthesia. You know, he was going to like see if he could, you know, not go asleep. So afterward, Johnny comes out and he's like cold like a corpse, and I'm kind of freaked out. And he's coming out of surgery, and there's the great master, and he's like, you know, on the slab. But so he's not just, you know, lying there like half dead, but he's like really cold, because the surgery is kept cold and everything else they do to make it a sterile environment. And he comes out, and so then when he wakes up and the doctors come around and everything, and he starts to recover, and he recovered quite quickly. And he says, you didn't give me a chance. You didn't warn me, you know, before they put the anesthesia. You know, he thought he was going to get warned. He said, okay, here it comes. You know, let's see if you can fight it. And he says, it was like he came up and clobbered me alongside the head. You know, I was gone. So he was kind of a little upset that he had not been given the chance to see if he could overcome, which I don't think he would have, the powerful drugs to put him asleep. So from that point forward, things started to deteriorate more, and I continued to be with him, and then came the point where and then a lot of people blamed, so he stayed in Bangkok for some time, being around doctors and carrying on. People would come and go, and he was kind of more liberal for people coming to see him, but he was staying with supporters in Bangkok to kind of recover, and because there was the demand and stuff up at his monastery in Ubon, up in the northeast of Thailand, was tremendous. And so that he and then it was finally that, okay, well, it's time to go back, and there's photos here. See him coming back. You see him kind of this procession, and I mean they're very distinct. I can see them very clearly when he came back. And he wasn't. I don't really believe in the end that this stunt really accomplished anything. That's what I could see. But he came back, and of course everybody was gathered and welcoming him back, and it was quite. Lovely to see, kind of they have their great venerable father has returned. But everybody was showing up with every remedy you could think, so he'd had the brain kind of thing, but everybody was showing up with medications, herbal remedies. And he was an absolute sucker, bless his heart, forgive me, Luang Por Chah. But he was a real sucker for these things. I mean, he just, oh, we got this, this is, so then like diabetes came up and what he should have and what he should eat and everything. Of course, monitoring diabetes for a monk and one meal a day is very difficult to try to, and he wasn't taking insulin or anything. But I'm convinced that many of these herbal remedies were quite powerful. And the thing, and I think modern doctors kind of tend to agree that some are open to homeopathic remedies and things, but it's hard to kind of one of the complaints that I hear, and I heard that is like there's no regulation. How much is the dosage and what is it, and then how much in this. So there's not this ability to kind of regulate the dosage. So they were giving these remedies, and I remember one day they boiled up this thing was for diabetes, and he knocked it back, And I think actually he his brain got starved to some extent. I don't know, but I just thinking back, and I remember at the time thinking, I think that had some impact, because it couldn't really know, because then there was a point he really seemed to be less stable, less clear, and we'd say we started to kind of lose him, where certain things begin to happen. And I don't feel appropriate to say some of the things, but he started to become an old man and get somewhat forgetful and things, and so it was really very difficult to observe this and be there, and then be in the middle of people wanting to help him, truly wanting to help him, and we had our kind of marching orders from the doctors in Bangkok. So these are his meds and everything. So we had a regimen of medication, but here's people coming in and intervening. And once we were up there, it was kind of out of my control. Other than getting a rifle or something and standing at the door. People were coming, and I just kind of had to back off at some point. Wow. So it had to play itself out. This was all part of his greatness, his karma, and everything. And so I hope, in some way, I'm honored and humbled to be sharing this story. And so I'd like to continue a little longer. And so what happened was, then we got, and I shared this at some point. Maybe it was the aging weekend. I'm not sure, but. There came the invitation from the king and queen that invited him to come back to Bangkok, and he'd already said, "Mo po lao, I'm done with the doctors, no more, leave me be." And so that was the point where things changed, and he had said that, but then he no longer was really able to speak for himself. So this invitation came. So the elders met and made this decision. Did I talk about this? Or was that the aging weekend? Did I talk about this already? Did I? Yes? A little bit. Huh? Yeah. A little bit, yeah. Well, anyway, the decision was made, and it was basically that they really didn't feel, it was kind of like them being able to say, no, you can't come and see him, is that they felt that this invitation was coming from the highest in the land, next to the Sangha Raja, the Supreme Patriarch of that they really had to honor. And so they said, well, we should let him go. And of course he wasn't in a position to resist. He was really kind of at the mercy and the kindness. And of course it was all coming from loving kindness and wanting to do their best. But I remember, and I'm kind of remembered and spoke about, and we'll go down in history for this, but it was quite touching, and I'd like to share it with you, because I kind of forgot about it and people would say it, but it was a very moving moment. So he was less stable, and sometimes, just to move forward would be difficult. So of course we had internal jets, airline service within Thailand, from Melbourne to Bangkok, and you could be there like in an hour or something. The train was like all night, so there was no question we're gonna fly him to Bangkok. So everybody comes out to see him off, and so we get to, and this was, plane just on a tarmac, and the stairs go up. So we got out, and everybody said goodbye, and so we're getting to the base of the stairs, and he's really reluctant, and I think almost incapable of going up these stairs. And so here I am next to him, trying to encourage him. I was like, "Oh, Luang Por, we need to go up the stairs." And it was I don't even remember that he said, "Well, I can't do it," or "I don't," whatever. And I just said, "Well, here we go." And I just reached down and picked him up, carried him up the steps, this flight of stairs, and into the airplane, and put him in his seat. So of course that's in many people's minds, where, I picked him up and took him onto the plane, and it was, that I would even do such a thing. But it was very clear. He wasn't going to make it. There's nobody else who was going to do that. They didn't have any means of getting him up there in some kind of lift or something, so I had to be the lift. From then on, it really, there was a period, and that some of you may have already faced or may face, that his care and the regulation of medications and everything. He had this, suite in the hospital, and people would come, and it was quite easy to keep tabs on who came, who went, and people would come to see him. Senior monks would come down, and all, went fine. But I was getting burnt, big time burnt, and I think people were afraid of me to a certain extent, because not of my bigness, but I was also very attached to this. I felt like, I was the one that, was kind of in charge to some extent, and not, there was a certain arrogance there and blindness, but also I had been there from the beginning, so you can imagine my kind of attachment to the situation, wanting to, maintain a certain control and influence, and it was very difficult for me to ultimately let that go. But I remember one time we would feed him and things, and it was getting more difficult for him to eat and things, and he'd not want things and stuff. And so there came a period, and this is hard to say, but that he was incredibly resistant. He just was like, no. And when he said no, it was like, back off. And he was quite strong. And so with the medication or with eating and stuff. And there was another monk with me who lived here for a while, Ajahn Boon Lurt. And if I hadn't had him as my kind of with me, I think he just was such a support for me. And so if I had to kind of have a break, he came in and was able to do it. But I remember this one time that, as this relationship had been on for all these years, and the humility and everything, that he pushed, something in me that I didn't like. I got very, very cross with him and, angry. And I never feared I would ever do anything. But I know when I says, well, you got to go in there, I was like, you old so-and-so, I'm going to pick you up and throw you out the window. I was like so distraught that he was being that way. And he wasn't himself, whatever that was. This was not something, although there maybe was a part just trying to say, I really want to be left alone. And so you can imagine the confusion and everything that I felt. And so it was terribly difficult and quite traumatic. So eventually we came back, and they had built this wonderful purpose-built kind of clinic. It was all self-contained. It had a kitchen. It had his room all set up with a hospital bed, and just like a hospital. Beautiful, bathroom with rails and everything to look after someone elderly. And it was kind of, contained from the rest of this little house. It was on one story, so everything was really perfect for his care. And I don't remember exactly how much longer I stayed on, but I think back, and I feel very humbled and honored that how I helped set that up, and the peace that I had in it, that I felt I really kind of set it up for a routine to begin, and for the next 10 years to unfold, and for his care. And the care was just incredible. It was just, we never had to use a catheter, or even, they'd sometimes for a male they'd use a condom and a catheter tube. We never had to do that. Why? Because there was always 2 monks, no less than 2 monks with him all the time. So if he even, trickled a little bit, and he'd move, and the urinal, the male urinal would move with him, and if there was anything, it was cleaned, and he was cleaned, and it went out and came back. And so the care, if you can imagine it, he just had like this perfect care, this such love, and everything was always with reverence, looking after this great teacher, this great master. And so so it was hard for him not to live because of all this care. A bed sore, don't talk about a bed sore, even a little hint of it, because we'd turn him and everything was kept clean, and he just had this perfect care. But in the end it was somewhat sad, because to actually feed him, they got these big syringes in the end and put these tubes at the end of the syringes, and everything would be osterized into to mush, so they could feed him. So you got good at like feeding him. You'd have these big syringes, and you kind of, I think some of the funny commercials, you'd kind of come in and say, "All right, here's another bite." You squirt it in his mouth, but you had to be just right, or you cause him to choke. So there was a lot of skill in getting him to eat without putting the tube in and everything. But so when I left, he was still voluntarily eating, but was not communicative in a verbal way. And so where he was consciously, I don't even want to speculate, because I really don't know. But what I believe is that this period of time, it was like, almost a sacrifice on his part to even though he had said no, that the community said yes. And so it had these 10 years for disciples that never even met him, and that came, young monks that came that probably never even heard him speak live, were there to look after the great master and have that honor and that blessing to do that. So that he had this care that was just incredible. I think it's in kind of historically probably one of those rare things that happens to a great person like this. And even you take, like, in a worldly sense, a king or a queen, that there would be people, but there was no one there that didn't come with love in their hearts and the best of intentions. So, and there was no gain. It wasn't like, well, we'll pay you a lot of money. Money, as I said before, it could not buy the amount of love and care and tenderness that was given to him. And the kind of final act that I did for him is when I had moved here then and left and gone through that trauma of leaving, and Ajahn Sumedho encouraged me and he knew I was burnt out, but he knew I had to be ready, and so I was, and I came and had 7 more very good years of monastic life. But there was a point where we decided to, I did the research on a wheelchair for him. We did an Everest and Jennings, and I don't know, I'm thinking computer, but we didn't have that in those days, so I don't know how I did the research, but I got materials and stuff and looked through. It was one of the things I enjoy doing. So we got this just perfect wheelchair. It had every gadget. It wasn't, that you could care for an elderly person. It'd go up and down. It had a commode seat built in. It'd go back. You could lie down. You could sit up. You could half lie, half sit. And so we got this whole thing together and put it together, and we, raised the money for it. We got it. And so then it was like I said to saying to Ajahn Sumedho, I said, I'm going to have to do a video. This is complicated, this wheelchair. So I think, we need to do a video or something so I can talk and go through it and how to use it. Well, Ajahn Sumedho, bless his heart, and he thought about that, and it was just the next day, whatever, and he says, well, Prabhakaro, he said, there's been enough money here that you could actually accompany the wheelchair to Thailand. And I was like, oh, how perfect, I'd kind of put this together, and, what an honor to carry this great offering to the Master in Thailand. And so it was wonderful because I brought it, got it there, and unpacked it, and showed the monks, and, it was perfect. It was everything, he couldn't not, it was like the perfect meditation, he couldn't but if we wanted him perfectly straight, he was perfectly straight, if we wanted him half back, he was half back, but yet it was so comfortable and for his care and looking after him, and of course he wasn't walking at that point and needed such a kind of a piece of equipment to be instrumental in his care and well-being. So that was kind of my final act, and that was my final trip until he died many years later, because I came back here and stayed until 1991, and then he died. Was 92, right?
January 92.
January 92 on my birthday. It was January 16th, and so I went back for his funeral. Then a year later, so that I hope in some way this is the story has never been told, and I don't mean that from the deepest humility in my heart. And Anjada had encouraged me, and I was thinking, I says, I don't know if I want to talk about this, and I don't know. It wasn't anything other than I'm not sure how well I can piece it together and what parts to weave in and so on. But I certainly feel that I think it's important to know kind of the human side of what went on, that everyone here can relate to in his care and love, and each of us in our way has this love and care for people that we care about and care for, and can that we need to make decisions and choices. And of course maybe that's an example of some of the most complex, and as complex as it may get, but that it all unfolded, and that he when he died, and I've never really heard the kind of final days of his life. I know he was in pretty rough shape, and in the end, and so one might argue that, oh well, they really kept him going longer than they wished to, and everything. But that point where they said, well, let's go back to Bangkok for the King and Queen's doctors, that was the point. And I think that's important to note, that there was no turning back then. At what point it's kind of like, when do you shut off the machine kind of thing, who's going to make that decision? And so these are these are literally life and death kind of situations that we all will face with our loved ones and ourselves. And so in the context of this wonderful period of time we're sharing together on these very pressing matters of birth, aging, illness, and death, that I hope that everyone is compelled to look more deeply and to put one's affairs in order as much as possible. I've been trying to call my mother, and I'm not sure what I'm going to say, and I know I could get a text, a email, whatever, from my sister, and it's not like it's touch and go kind of, she's at that point, but it could. It's just she's at that point in her life. So I was feeling the context of the retreat, and it's really hard to time it, because when she gets up and this assisted living and the time here and the kind of energy I have after a day long, so the best time to give my mother as a call is after everything's happened here, like 9:30 or 10 o'clock, and of course I'm just full of energy to call my mother. So, but I've been I tried earlier today, and just wanting to say hi and see if there was anything I could say other than just checking in with her and tell her I love her. So I think that's enough for this evening. Thank you for being here, and for bearing witness to this story, and I give it with great respect and honor to a great teacher who all of us revere in some way. Those of us that were very blessed to be in his presence for a time, and that he lives on in all of us, just like the Buddha does, and the teachings and what we've been given. So, thank you.